From the mind of Mark Yoshimoto Nemkov.
So, Ustral, this dude, he said, "Hey man, you want to talk about DIY?" And I'm like, "Yes." So, yeah, let's talk about microphone DIY. First, though, I want to just mention. So this, of course, is the TLMYN, my prototype I've been working on. This is prototype version 3. And I've decided to go with prototype version 3 as this is it. This is what the microphone is going to be. This capsule, my circuit, this body, this form factor. So there was a prototype 4, but I just didn't I felt like immediately 3 was better. So we're going with version 3. And I'm really happy about it. So I wanted to let you know that this is now officially, TLMYN was like a working title. This is now officially the assassin microphone, because I like saying this is the microphone assassin microphone. So anyway, I will have more details on this as I try to figure out the logistics of how to make this happen. There's been a lot. It's been a lot going on lately, and we're getting into my busy season, one of my busy seasons. So, gonna figure it out. Maybe I just make a couple at first and put them up on eBay. Let you guys fight it out, see what happens. But microphone DIY. So this is the culmination. I was thinking about this. I was like, how long have I been doing this? This is the culmination of about a decade of microphone DIY. And I got into microphone DIY with no electronic experience, right? Knowing nothing. I know what an electron is. I know what a neutron is, a proton. But, it's like how circuits work, how to solder, how microphones are built, what works. These are things I knew nothing about. So I got into it as a total, a total noob. And 10 years later, I'm building my own microphones with my own circuit, and it's been a rewarding experience. No matter what happens beyond this point, I've achieved far more than I intended to. When I first got into microphone DIY, I was very intimidated by it, but I knew I had to do it. There's, and I've mentioned this before. When I was at Berkeley, my good friend Blake Morgan and I, we had this obsession with the Robert Redford movie, The Natural. And especially it's like, this idea of his Wonder Boy bat, this bat that is hewn from a tree that had been struck by lightning in his backyard. I mean, you talk about mythical, it's Excalibur. So this bespoke instrument of the business was always kind of like this idea. And at school, I had a guitar that I'd, made myself a parts caster that took me all 4 years through Berkeley playing this parts caster. And so I really, when it got time to think about like voiceover and all that, immediately I was like, you know what? I'm looking for the Wonder Boy bat. So the idea to go into microphone DIY for me really had more to do with how do I create a tool that optimizes my skill set, my sound. What can I do to flatter myself? And trying a lot of microphones out there and finding like a lot of discrepancy between how microphones sound and not really landing on anything I really liked. And then the other aspect was it was just a pure fascination with microphones. And so somewhere you combine those two energies into an obsession with microphone DIY. And I think a lot of people can relate to that. So getting into microphone DIY, you have to understand that, a lot of what you read online about microphone DIY is changing and has changed. A lot of it, I got into it by modding microphones, buying cheap microphones on eBay. And back then, you could buy these cheap MXL microphones, the ones with the through-hole components. Now they're all made with surface mount components. And so you could buy these older cheap microphones on eBay that like CAD GXL 2200 and like MXL was a V63. I forget which one it was. The 2001. A lot of these, they all had the same like They all have the same transformerless SHEPS like circuit. So you could buy a bunch of different ones and they'd all have the same circuit. And I would just buy these microphones and I'd be like, what would happen if I took this part out and replaced it with something bigger? What if I put a bigger capacitor here? And then, a lot of times you destroy the microphone. Oops. And then sometimes you're like, wow, that is amazing. So the way I got into it was really kind of like very primitive. Just like, I take this part out now and put this part in, how it happens. And you learn from your mistakes pretty quickly. And even though the microphones were cheap on eBay, you still don't want to buy stuff and be like, oh, I just destroyed it. Oops, I just slipped and I put my soldering iron right through the membrane of the capsule. These things happen. And when you get into microphone DIY, it's not a cheap hobby. And you have to be careful. So if you really want to get into it, let's talk about it more. But you have to understand that it's a process. It's a process that's not just going to be as cut and dry as I'm going to buy a bunch of parts, slap them together, and I'm going to have my dream mic. And I think a lot of times you go into it and you hope that every microphone that you build is something that blows your mind. And when that happens, the satisfaction that you feel building a tool of your trade that not only will you use but sounds great is it is really like the pinnacle of what you're looking for in this experience. When you get into building microphones, you have to learn how to solder. First and foremost, you have to learn how to solder. And it's not that hard, and you may be intimidated by it. And it may require you buying a soldering iron. I would suggest don't buy a cheapy $10 soldering iron to build mics. You can buy a cheapy $10 soldering iron in order to learn how to solder. You can get into the concept of learning how to solder. And there are a ton of videos on YouTube of how to do it. It's how I learned how to do it. There are a ton of videos, and it's very simple. It's really a process of learning how to do it consistently so you don't burn yourself, you don't burn your house down, you don't destroy or melt any components, and you make nice, beautiful little solder dome blobs on your PCB and everything works. So we can talk more about it, but I just really wanted to talk about the mindset of getting into DIY and being prepared for it. So if you can solder, you don't necessarily have to read a schematic to build a microphone, but it helps. Understanding a schematic helps immensely. So these are like things that you have to consider before you get into microphone DIY. And there are places like Microphone Parts that make it so simple. The Microphone Parts microphones are generally pretty good. I don't know if I would call them world-class microphones, but they definitely, I hate this phrase, punch above their price point. Everybody overuses the crap out of that phrase. So if you can solder, if you can read directions, the Microphone Parts catalog of microphones, of those kits, is a great place to start. My goal when I got into it was to build a vintage U87 clone from scratch. And that took 5 years. It took me 5 years to get to the point where I could do that. And that was a lot of, and I mean, I'm not talking about 5 years of working on it every day, but, it's like tinkering with it and increasing in the frequency in which I'm tinkering with it. And again, destroying a lot of mics in the process and trying to modify microphones. But I would suggest start with Microphone Parts. The whole concept of modding mics, I think is really not so much a thing anymore because most microphones these days, it's hard to find these through-hole component ones. And quite honestly, unless you're making really drastic changes, like some of the things that I did to these circuits, really stressing these circuits in ways that are probably ill-advised, you're not going to really gain a lot, but you'll gain a lot of knowledge doing it. But if you get into building microphones through the Microphone Parts kits, you get an understanding of how these things are laid out, what it is that makes up a microphone, and they give you all the parts. Everything is the FET, really the field effect transistor in there that drives the sound of the microphone. That's already pre-calibrated for you, which is a step like biasing your FET is a step that you have to do on your own when you build like a U87 from scratch, like, one of those Danny Bouchard 87s. These are things that are a little bit more difficult and require like an oscilloscope but as long as you have the skills to solder by yourself, you can buy a cheap, multimeter because you need to check voltages. But I mean, you can buy a multimeter I got by with a $20 multimeter for years. As long as you can read voltages, read resistances, that's pretty much all you need to really build mics from kits. The instructions are great. Follow them. Take your time. Take your time. Because one of the things, the difficulty with soldering when you are a noob, once you get the soldering part down, which you could actually do in one afternoon. Really, there are kits out there that you can buy, soldering practice kits, where they give you a PCB and a bunch of just like cheap parts and you solder them to the board. And sometimes some of these cheap kits actually have circuits that work. So you solder everything in and you hook up a battery and you press a button and a thing lights up and you're like, okay, wow, I built that, right? It's simple, but I mean, again, it's like the process of doing it and completing a circuit and it's a big deal. So once you do that, the other thing you have to remember is you have to know how to unsolder. And unsoldering is a lot more complicated. So watch videos on how to unsolder because sometimes you'll make mistakes. Certain parts, certain components need to be oriented in a specific way. Like, they can't be reversed because they have like certain capacitors require a certain polarity. So if you reverse it, the circuit won't work. So a lot of times, I have in the past like installed a part into the wrong way or into the wrong part on the board, and removing it in such a way that you can cleanly take it out without damaging the board, without damaging the part, without compromising your ability to put the right part in that hole, because you may leave behind like a blob of solder that makes it more difficult to slip the new part into the holes in the PCB. So learning how to unsolder is crucial. So really, again, I like to preach being prepared for stuff when you do it. And I think this holds true for building for DIY microphones. Learn a few skills first. You can buy a simple kit from Microphone Parts. Start with like one of the smaller ones, right? One of the ones that have fewer pieces to it. Don't jump into like a big complicated, like I'm going to build a big tube mic. Build like a little electret mic and really enjoy the process and understand that the whole journey of going from not knowing what you're doing at all to building like something that is yours and designing it and making it from scratch is a long journey. If you have an electronics background, if you already know how to solder, if you've built stuff before, microphone DIY is not that hard. Microphones are not very complicated circuits at all. And, most microphone circuits haven't changed a whole lot in decades. So building these old-fashioned circuits is easy if you know what you're doing. But if you don't, and like me, you come into it with eyes wide open and a lot of hopes and dreams and not realizing how many times you are going to burn yourself with a soldering iron, you have to accept that the process takes patience. And you have to accept that when you go and you build something, you are going to take your time, you're going to breathe. You're going to make sure you're going to double check every component is in the right place before you solder it into place. You're going to really, you don't rush. When you build a microphone, you don't rush it. If it's something that the kit says you can build in 2 hours, take 3 hours to build it, right? Or take a couple of days to build it. Solder a few pieces in and then walk away. I know, it's hard. It's hard because you're like, "I wanna get this done. I wanna know if it works. I wanna know what it sounds like. I wanna have that feeling of satisfaction of having built something." But patience is a huge part of DIY. So it's not for everyone, but if you are inclined to do it, if you're inclined to try it, I am definitely I am definitely a big proponent of, being hands-on like that because, you never know in the end what's gonna happen. Alright. So I'm gonna talk more about DIY. I just wanted to talk the philosophy of DIY really. Like, for anyone who's thinking about it, these are things to consider before you jump in with both feet. Um, it is there are moments where, it's not just burning yourself. Not that long ago, I was soldering something and, I was pulling a part, out, like, I was basically removing again, I had incorrectly, wired, the XLR jack. I'd reversed 2, wires, because you know what? I wasn't paying attention. And as I was pulling the wire out of the jack after I applied the soldering iron to it, a tiny blob, a little tiny blob of hot solder hit me right on my eyelid. And it was only through the miracle of either fast reaction or just the timing of my blink that little blob of solder didn't just like hit my eyeball and just right through. So so now I'm going to wear goggles when I do stuff like that. So yeah, I mean, you can hurt yourself. So be careful. And if you are inclined, let's talk about DIY. All right, what do you think, Nation? I gotta know. Until next time, this is Mark Yoshimoto Nemkov on the Assassin microphone, fading to black.